There's a moment in American history that changed everything. A moment when one man looked at the dirt beneath his feet and saw the future. When poverty became power. When steel became stronger than gold. And when the American dream turned into something nobody could have predicted. This is the story of how a poor Scottish immigrant became the richest man in the world. How he built an empire so powerful it could have bought and sold entire countries. And how in one violent summer, that empire nearly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. This is the rise and fall of Andrew Carnegie. And I promise you, this story is nothing like what they taught you in school. The Boy Who Had Nothing, 1848. A small, cramped ship crosses the Atlantic Ocean. Below, in conditions most people today couldn't imagine surviving for a single night, sits a 13-year-old boy named Andrew Carnegie. He's skinny, he's scared, and he owns exactly one change of clothes. His family fled Scotland because they were starving, not the kind of hunger where you skip lunch, the kind where you watch your father, a skilled weaver, become worthless overnight because machines took his job. The kind where your mother has to beg for scraps to feed her children. Young Andrew made a promise to himself on that ship, a promise he would repeat every single day for the rest of his life. He would never be poor again. He would never be powerless again. And he would do whatever it took to make that happen. Whatever it took, the Carnegie family arrived in Allegheny, Pennsylvania with almost nothing. Andrew's first job was in a textile factory. He worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. His pay, $1.20 per week. He was 13 years old. But here's what nobody tells you about Carnegie. He wasn't just working. He was watching, learning, calculating. Every moment of every day, his mind was moving like a machine, looking for the angle, the opportunity, the way out. He taught himself telegraphy, taught himself accounting, taught himself how to read people, how to spot opportunities, how to make himself indispensable. By age 18, he was a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad. By 24, he was a superintendent making $1,500 a year. From $1.20 a week to $1,500 a year in 11 years. Most people would have been satisfied. Most people would have stopped there. Andrew Carnegie was just getting started. The metal that built America, here's something that's hard to understand if you didn't live through it. In the mid-1800s, America was still mostly wood. Wood buildings, wood bridges, wood everything. And wood burns, wood breaks, wood rots. But steel. Steel was different. Steel was forever. The problem was that making steel was incredibly expensive, incredibly slow, and incredibly difficult. It was a luxury material. Something for the rich. Something for special occasions. Then in 1856, a British engineer named Henry Bessemer figured out how to make steel faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. The Bessemer process could turn iron into steel in minutes instead of days. It was revolutionary. Most people didn't understand what this meant. Andrew Carnegie did. He saw the future in that process. He saw railroads made of steel stretching across the entire continent. He saw steel buildings rising into the sky. He saw bridges spanning rivers that wood could never cross. He saw an America built on steel, and he saw himself controlling it all. In 1873, Carnegie made his move. He built his first steel plant near Pittsburgh. He called it the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, named after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. His biggest potential customer, smart, strategic, ruthless, but building the plant wasn't the genius part. What Carnegie did next changed American business forever. The system that crushed everyone. Carnegie didn't just want to make steel. He wanted to control every single step of making steel. He wanted total domination. He bought iron mines. He bought coal mines. He bought limestone quarries. He bought railroads to transport the materials. He bought ships to carry the iron ore. He bought the docks where the ships unloaded. This strategy is called vertical integration. Carnegie didn't invent it, but he perfected it. He owned the entire process from the ground to the finished product. Every step, every penny of profit. His competitors couldn't compete. They had to buy their raw materials from suppliers who charged them market rates. Carnegie supplied himself. They had to pay railroads to ship their goods. Carnegie owned his own railroads. They had overhead costs at every step. Carnegie eliminated those costs. It was brilliant, it was unstoppable, and it was absolutely brutal. Steel plants started closing. Smaller companies went bankrupt. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Entire towns that depended on those plants collapsed. Carnegie bought the ruins for pennies on the dollar and absorbed them into his empire. By 1890, Carnegie Steel Company was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. One company, one man. More than an entire nation. Carnegie was worth millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. In today's money, he was worth over $300 billion. Richer than Jeff Bezos. Richer than Elon Musk. The richest self-made man in American history. But there was a cost. A terrible, bloody cost that Carnegie would spend the rest of his life trying to justify. The town called Homestead, Pennsylvania. Summer of 1892. This is where everything changed. The Homestead Steel Works was one of Carnegie's largest plants. 3,800 workers. Massive production, huge profits. But the workers had a union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. And their contract was about to expire. The union wanted fair wages, reasonable hours, safe working conditions, basic human dignity. Carnegie's partner, Henry Clay Frick, had different ideas. Frick was a man who made Carnegie look soft. He was cold, calculating, and he absolutely despised unions. Here's what most people don't know. Carnegie publicly positioned himself as a friend of the working man. He wrote essays about the responsibility of the wealthy to their workers. He talked about fairness and dignity and the rights of labor. But when it came time to negotiate with the Homestead workers, Carnegie conveniently left for Scotland. He left Frick in charge, and he knew exactly what Frick would do. Frick's offer to the union was simple. Take a pay cut or you're fired. The union refused. So Frick locked them out. He built a fence around the entire plant, topped with barbed wire. Workers started calling it Fort Frick. Then Frick hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. 300 armed guards to break the strike and take back the plant by force. The battle that shocked America, July 6, 1892. 4 in the morning. 2 barges carrying 300 Pinkerton agents float quietly up the Monongahela River toward Homestead. But the workers knew they were coming. Thousands of them lined the riverbank, armed, angry, desperate. What happened next was a battle, not a protest. Not a confrontation, a battle. Gunfire erupted. The Pinkertons tried to land. The workers fought them back. Dynamite was thrown. A small cannon was fired. Men on both sides fell. Blood stained the river. The fight lasted 14 hours. When it finally ended, 7 workers were dead. 3 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens more were wounded. The Pinkertons surrendered and were marched through town, beaten and brutalized by angry crowds. The governor of Pennsylvania called in the state militia. 8,000 troops occupied Homestead. The strike was broken. The union was destroyed. Frick won, and Carnegie. Carnegie was in Scotland, writing letters claiming he had nothing to do with it, claiming he would have handled it differently, claiming he supported the workers. Nobody believed him. Not then, not now. The Homestead Strike changed how America saw Andrew Carnegie. He wasn't a self-made hero anymore. He was a robber baron, a man who built his fortune on the backs and the blood of working people. A man who preached charity but practiced cruelty. Carnegie spent the rest of his life trying to repair his reputation. And the way he chose to do it was almost as controversial as the strike itself. The greatest sale in history, 1900. Carnegie was 65 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life building his steel empire. He controlled 40% of all American steel production. His company was worth hundreds of millions. Then J.P. Morgan came calling. Morgan was the most powerful banker in America, maybe the most powerful banker in the world. He had a vision of consolidating the entire American steel industry into one massive super corporation. And he needed Carnegie Steel to do it. Carnegie didn't want to sell. This was his life's work, his legacy. His proof that the poor Scottish boy had conquered the world. But Morgan made an offer Carnegie couldn't refuse. $480 million in cash. In 1900, think about that number. $480 million in 1900 is worth over $150 billion today. The largest business transaction in history up to that point. Carnegie sold. Morgan created U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. And Andrew Carnegie walked away the richest man in the world with nothing left to prove and everything left to justify. The gospel of wealth. Here's where Carnegie's story gets really interesting and really complicated. Carnegie believed something that sounds insane to modern ears. He believed that dying rich was shameful. He believed that a wealthy man who didn't give away his fortune before he died was a disgrace. He called it the gospel of wealth. The idea that the rich had a moral obligation to use their money to improve society. Not through charity that created dependency, but through institutions that helped people help themselves. So Carnegie started giving it away. All of it. Libraries, schools, universities, concert halls, scientific research. He built over 2,500 libraries across America and around the world. He founded Carnegie Mellon University. He established pension funds for teachers and steelworkers. By the time he died in 1919, he had given away 90% of his fortune. Over $350 million. Billions in today's money. People called him the patron saint of philanthropy. The man who proved that capitalism and compassion could coexist. The greatest philanthropist in American history. But others saw something different. They saw a man trying to buy forgiveness for Homestead. A man trying to wash blood off his hands with libraries and universities. A man who took everything from workers while they were alive and then gave it back after he'd squeezed every drop of profit from their labor. The question nobody can answer. So who was Andrew Carnegie really? Was he the self-made immigrant who proved that America was the land of opportunity? The poor boy who became the richest man in the world through intelligence, hard work, and vision? Or was he a ruthless robber baron who crushed his competitors, exploited his workers, and built his empire on human suffering? Was he the greatest philanthropist in history who gave away billions to improve the world? Who built institutions that educated millions and lifted entire communities? Or was he a man desperately trying to buy redemption for the blood of Homestead, trying to convince himself and the world that the end justified the means? The truth is probably all of it. Carnegie was brilliant and brutal, generous and ruthless, visionary and vicious. He was the American dream and the American nightmare wrapped into one complicated, contradictory human being. His steel built the bridges we drive across, the buildings we work in, railroads that connected the continent. His libraries educated generations of Americans who couldn't afford books. His universities trained scientists and engineers who changed the world. But his workers died in his factories. Their blood stained the rivers of Pennsylvania. Their families starved while he dined with presidents and kings. The empire that never really fell. Here's the thing about Carnegie's empire. It didn't really fall. It transformed. U.S. Steel, the company J.P. Morgan built from Carnegie Steel, still exists today. The libraries Carnegie built still serve millions of people. Carnegie Mellon is one of the top universities in the world. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace still works toward global stability. Carnegie's physical empire became something bigger than steel. It became institutions, ideas, systems that outlived him and will probably outlive all of us. But the question remains, at what cost? Was it worth it? Can we celebrate the libraries while condemning Homestead? Can we honor the philanthropy while acknowledging the exploitation? These aren't easy questions. They're not supposed to be, because Andrew Carnegie's story isn't really about one man. It's about America, about what we value, about what we're willing to sacrifice for success, about whether the ends justify the means, about whether you can do terrible things and still be remembered as a hero. Carnegie believed you could. He spent the last 19 years of his life trying to prove it, giving away every penny, building monuments to knowledge and culture and human advancement. On his deathbed, his last words were reportedly about his regrets, about the men who died at Homestead, about the price of his empire. But we'll never know for sure if he really meant it. The libraries made up for the blood. If the gospel of wealth redeemed the gospel of greed, that's for you to decide. That's the question history leaves us with. The rise and fall of Andrew Carnegie wasn't just about steel. It was about the soul of American capitalism. And that question is just as relevant today as it was in 1892, maybe more so.